European art was very clouded and ethnocentric. In the original photo I was given, a European was leading a force, with some First Nations following him. He has access to a large force behind him, while the First Nations only have plains with no tree in sight. The First Nations fighting against the Europeans look savage, jumping over each other like animals, with the Europeans and their allies being more formal and organized. In my reinterpretation of the drawing, I have tried to make it more realistic and mirror the past, from the perspective of the First Nations people. In the original photo, the European is leading a small group of First Nations who are behind him. In reality, the First Nations would be leading the European, because the First Nations have been on that land for hundreds of years, compared to the tiny period the Europeans have been on the land. The Europeans would often get First Nations people to guide them all over the New World, whether that's hunting for beavers or finding new villages. My reinterpretation doesn't have any First Nations behind the European, because I would rather focus on the impact the Europeans had alone on the land. A very large change I made was making the Europeans' land destroyed and dry, while the First Nations had very fertile land with life. There is a wildfire behind the Europeans, showing their growth is like a wildfire, destroying everything in its path. The First Nations are like the barricade, trying to stop the ever-growing and creeping European power. The First Nations had very savage-looking body language and facial expressions in the original photo. I tried to keep them in a more organized group with no people leaping over each other. The original photo had tens of First Nations, but I reduced that number because the First Nations didn't have hundreds of soldiers to fight one European, especially once they had made permanent settlements in North America. With there being many fights between First Nations and Europeans, many didn't have as significant meaning as others. Because I didn't want to focus on a single fight like a certain tribe or an island near Quebec against a group of European explorers, I decided to have it show the First Nations against all Europeans as a whole, instead of it being a clash of people or nations. You think about it more like culture of First Nations, with large beliefs in nature, equality of rights, and only taking what is needed, and other qualities of the First Nations people, against a more powerful European culture of monarchy, greed, Christianity, and ethnocentrism. My goal was to make it something that never ends, unlike a battle that is won or lost. It is a battle that is still going on today, with First Nations fighting for what they believe in and to recover stories, language, and land they lost. The consequences of colonization today is having the ideas of European people carved into the Western world where we live right now. It started battles for stolen land and lost ways of life, and it has shaped the world into what it is today and what it will be tomorrow.